slavery didn't begin with chains in America. It began with power, with conquest, with kingdoms, both African and European, trading flesh for wealth, survival, and control. Before the Middle Passage, before plantations, there was a global system already turning humans into currency. This is not just about brutality. It's about economics, empires, and how the past still shapes the world today. So we ask, who built the machinery of slavery? And who paid the real price? This is the real origins of slavery, power, profit, and the global machine. Before the slave ships appeared on the horizon, before chains clinked along African coasts, there existed a vast, vibrant, and powerful Africa. Not a blank canvas waiting for European discovery, but a continent already painted with centuries of civilization, invention, and rule. Across the deserts, forests, rivers, and coasts thrived empires, African empires, with systems of government, bustling trade networks, elite universities, and powerful militaries. Africa before slavery was not one Africa, it was many, and each was distinct in its greatness. West Africa, Mali, Ghana, and the Golden Age. In the West, the Empire of Ghana, not the modern country, flourished from the 6th to 13th centuries, its wealth built on the gold-salt trade. Arab travelers rode in awe of its riches. But it was Mali, rising in the 13th century, that would become a legend. Under Mansa Musa, Mali reached its peak. When Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he traveled with a caravan so grand it shocked the Muslim world. With thousands of attendants, camels laden with gold, and gifts for every city he passed through, Musa gave away so much wealth that the price of gold fell in Cairo for over a decade. Mali's capital, Timbuktu, became a center of learning. The Sankore University attracted scholars from all over the Islamic world. There, students studied astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and Islamic law. Thousands of manuscripts, many still preserved, prove the depth of intellectual life. Mali was no outlier. Its successor, the Songhai Empire, expanded further, ruling vast lands and maintaining order with a structured bureaucracy, professional military, and codified laws under rulers like Askia the Great. North and Central Africa, stone cities, and diplomatic kingdoms. In modern-day Zimbabwe, an architectural wonder was rising, Great Zimbabwe. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries, this city featured towering stone walls, some reaching over 30 feet high, all built without mortar. These structures weren't mythical, they were real, and they remain to this day. Great Zimbabwe was part of a thriving trade network. Its goods, gold, ivory, iron, traded as far as China, Persia, and India. Chinese porcelain and Arab coins have been found among its ruins. Further west, the Kingdom of the Congo boasted central government, taxation, and foreign diplomacy by the 14th century. Its capital, Mbanza, Congo, became a hub of trade and politics. Early Portuguese explorers didn't bring civilization, they found it already thriving. Benin, the walled city, and the master sculptors. One of the most astonishing achievements of pre-colonial Africa was the Kingdom of Benin in present-day Nigeria. Its capital, Benin City, had urban planning, drainage systems, and defensive walls stretching over 16,000 kilometers, longer than the Great Wall of China. Even more remarkable were the Benin bronzes, intricately detailed plaques and sculptures cast from brass and bronze, depicting court life, warfare, and ritual. These artworks stunned European invaders in the 19th century, who looted thousands of pieces now housed in museums around the world. These were not tribal tokens, they were historical records crafted by elite guilds who passed down techniques over generations. The Sahel and nomadic empires. In the Sahel region, the transitional zone between the Sahara and the Savannah, nomadic and settled empires also thrived. The Tuareg, Kanem-Bornu, and other powers organized trade routes across the desert, protected by camel cavalry and governed by complex systems of alliance. They connected African interior markets to Mediterranean ports, making trans-Saharan commerce one of the most advanced trade systems of the medieval world. Goods, ideas, and religions, especially Islam, moved freely and reshaped African cities. Myth-busting the narrative. Africa before slavery was not a blank slate. It had flaws, as did all civilizations, with wars, hierarchy, and inequality. But it was never the barren, broken continent portrayed in colonial propaganda. Its people wore woven silks, built cities of stone, governed vast territories, and composed libraries of law and science. It produced generals, mathematicians, architects, and queens. The idea that Africa had no history before colonization is not just wrong. It's a deliberate lie, rooted in the justification of conquest. Before the first slave ship ever reached its shores, Africa had already built empires, explored the stars, and carved its story into stone and scroll. What slavery tried to erase, we must now reclaim. Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was already known by its own people and by the world. The first European ships to touch Africa's shores didn't arrive with chains. They came with curiosity, cannons, and greed. By the mid-1400s, Portugal had found its way to West Africa. Its explorers weren't seeking to understand African kingdoms. They were looking for gold, spices, and converts. What they found instead was a continent already buzzing with complex civilizations, trade routes, and cultural diversity. But it wasn't long before trade turned sinister. Africa had long practiced various forms of servitude, were captives, debt bondage, prisoners, but none of it was racial, lifelong, or designed to erase identity. What Europeans introduced was different. It was chattel slavery, human beings treated as property for life. And they didn't come to ask. In 1444, Portuguese raiders captured over 200 Africans near Mauritania and returned them to Lisbon. There, the people were paraded like prizes. Applause followed. Money followed. And then more ships. Raids escalated. What began as isolated attacks turned into state-backed missions. Armies were armed. Forts were built. And human beings were the new gold. On the coasts of modern-day Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria, European powers carved stone into nightmare. Elmina Castle, Cape Coast, Gorée Island. These were not forts of war. They were factories, processing centers for bodies. Beneath the surface were dark, windowless dungeons where enslaved Africans were packed by the hundreds. Some were held for days. Others for months. Disease spread. Air ran thin. Bodies collapsed. Above them, European officers drank wine. They attended church services. They danced. In some castles, churches were built directly above the slave dungeons. God above, chains below. This part of the story is painful and often weaponized, so let's get right. Yes, some African rulers participated in the trade. They sold prisoners of war. They struck deals with European traders. Some were greedy. Others were pressured. But Africa was not a monolith. And this wasn't a deal between equals. Europe came with gunpowder, ships, cannons. It exploited rivalries. It manufactured conflict to keep the supply flowing. And some Africans fought back. King Afonso of the Congo wrote desperate letters to the Portuguese king in the 1520s, pleading for the slave trade to stop. He warned of chaos, of social collapse. But Portugal ignored him. Power had tasted profit, and it wasn't letting go. They took the future. Captured Africans were not nobodies. They were artisans, blacksmiths, warriors, mothers, griots, priests. They took entire lineages, spoken histories, technological knowledge, agricultural systems, healers and architects. Villages vanished. Kingdoms fell. Wars were fueled just to feed the ships. The human cost wasn't just in the millions stolen, it was in the centuries of lost advancement. While Europe was building palaces and printing books, Africa was bleeding knowledge, culture, and people. From the Senegal River down to the Congo Basin, coastlines became gateways of horror. The Portuguese set the model. The Dutch followed. Then came the British, the French, the Spanish. They established outposts, garrisons, and mercantile companies, turning entire regions into slave-hunting zones. Luanda, Wida, Bani, and Ouida became infamous. These weren't just ports, they were pipelines. Millions passed through them. Millions more died trying to resist. And always hovering in the background were the Europeans orchestrating, arming, buying, and shipping. As captives were taken inland to the coast, something else happened. Something more silent, more insidious. Languages began to vanish. Names were lost. Ceremonies were disrupted. Elders were silenced. Even the griots, the sacred storytellers of West Africa, were captured. And with them, entire oral histories evaporated. Europe wasn't just stealing labor. It was erasing identity. By the 1600s, the slave trade had become industrial. Enter the Royal African Company, a British monopoly with a grim business plan. Its crest featured an elephant and shackles. It wasn't alone. France had the Company du Senegal. Portugal expanded its holdings, and the Dutch West India Company built slave ships by the dozen. These weren't pirates anymore. They were governments. They were businesses. and they turned Africa's pain into Europe's profit. It's important to remember, Africans did not simply submit. Some fled deep into the forests. Some burned villages to avoid capture. Some staged uprisings inside slave castles. There were kingdoms like Dahomey and Ashanti that weaponized the trade. But others fought it. Even within slave ports, rebellions broke out. Women led some of them. Priests chanted defiance in dying tongues. Entire ships were overtaken by captured Africans who chose the sea over chains. Resistance was not the exception. It was the heartbeat. Europe needed a justification. So it rewrote reality. In the 1600s and 1700s, European philosophers began publishing essays claiming Africans were inferior, that they lacked souls, that they were made for labor. Pseudoscience was born. Skulls were measured. Skin became a curse. And so the trade changed from a brutal practice to a belief system. Africa was no longer seen as human. It was seen as a resource. By the time the 1700s arrived, over 12,000 ships had left Europe's ports to raid Africa. Each trip required guns to arm collaborators, chains to bind, ships to pack, lies to justify, and at the center of it all, the African body. Sold, bought, traded, numbered, and waiting offshore were the slave ships. The Middle Passage was coming, but the world had already shifted. By the late 15th century, the winds over the Atlantic weren't just moving ships, they were moving an industry. And not just any industry. A beast born of greed, racism, and steel. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't a tragedy. It was a business. And like every business, it needed investment, infrastructure, and demand. It started with a triangle. Europe, Africa, the Americas. Ships left ports like Liverpool, Lisbon, and Bordeaux packed with guns, cloth, alcohol, beads, and manufactured goods. Their destination? The coasts of Africa, particularly West Africa, now dripping with Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British outposts. There they struck deals or staged raids. Africans were sold for iron and muskets. Sometimes by force. Sometimes by betrayal. Kingdoms like Dahomey and Ashanti, hungry for dominance, traded rivals and prisoners for European weapons. Once the ships were full, they set sail again. But this time, across the Middle Passage. This was no voyage, it was a nightmare. Men, women, and children were chained together below deck, shackled to wooden planks. No space to stand. Barely room to breathe. The stench of blood, sweat, vomit, and feces filled the air. Voyages lasted anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months. Up to 20% of the enslaved died en route, from dysentery, starvation, dehydration, or suicide. Some jumped into the ocean, choosing death over chains. Others were thrown overboard, like cargo gone bad. Insurance even covered lost cargo, meaning human lives had monetary value even in death. This wasn't a side hustle. It was cold, calculated logistics. Once they reached the Americas, Brazil, the Caribbean, the American South, enslaved Africans were auctioned like livestock. Inspected for strength, teeth, scars, fertility. Families were split. Names erased. They were bought to work. Sugarcane in Jamaica and Haiti. Tobacco and cotton in Virginia and Georgia. Coffee in Brazil. Indigo, rice, and rum across the colonies. The products of their labor were then shipped back to Europe. And the cycle restarted. This system was called the triangular trade, but in truth, it was a noose. A loop tightening around the necks of generations. The profits were obscene. Britain's economy boomed on cotton and sugar. France fed its elite with West Indian wealth. Spain and Portugal built fleets and cities on the backs of black bodies. Dutch banks, Swiss traders, and even Scandinavian merchants had a hand. Every bolt of cloth, every sip of rum, every spoonful of sugar, a thread in the Atlantic beast's web. And banks. Many still operating today, financed plantations, insured slave ships, or held the mortgages on enslaved lives. It wasn't charity. The transatlantic slave trade made modern Europe rich. It was capitalism. Africa didn't just lose people. It lost centuries of progress. Over 12 million Africans were forcibly removed, but the numbers go far beyond that. The trade fueled wars. Whole regions were destabilized. Kingdoms rose not through innovation, but through collaboration in slavery. Communities fled from coastal raids. Villages burned. Institutions collapsed. Africa was drained, not just of its people, but of its future. The scars are still visible. In borders. In conflict. In memory. This wasn't just an African and European affair. The Ottoman Empire taxed slave routes inland. Indian fabrics were traded for African captives. Chinese porcelain was found in West African trading posts. American indigenous tribes also participated, selling war captives to settlers. The slave trade connected 4 continents. It was the first truly global supply chain. And the product? Human lives. But don't believe it was one-sided. Many Africans resisted violently. Some jumped off ships, fought back on decks, poisoned their captors, revolted on plantations. Entire rebellions broke out, like the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, or the Maroons in Jamaica and Brazil. They didn't go quietly. They fought. And their resistance planted the seeds of abolition. The Atlantic beast didn't care about humanity. It cared about margins, efficiency, output. It didn't die all at once. Even after some countries abolished the trade, it continued illegally. It took over 400 years, millions of lives, and generations of resistance to finally slow the beast's breath. And still its shadow lingers. While kings signed treaties and generals drew battle lines, there were women who picked up the torch. They didn't rule from thrones or write history books. They made history with resistance, strategy, and unshakable courage. Across Africa and the Americas, in villages, slave castles, and battlefields, women rose. They led armies, hid fugitives, outsmarted empires. This is not the history you were taught. These are the warrior queens, the rebels, the women who fought and refused to be broken. In 1900, the British Empire made a demand that cut to the soul of the Ashanti people. They wanted the golden stool, not just a throne, but the sacred symbol of Ashanti identity, unity, and ancestral spirit. The chiefs hesitated. The air was thick with fear and defeat. But one woman stood up. Yasantawa, the queen mother of Ajisu, rose before the Ashanti leadership and thundered. If you men will not go forward, then we will. We the women will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight. She didn't speak as a royal figurehead. She spoke as a warrior. The war she sparked wasn't symbolic. It was siege, strategy, and sacrifice. Yasantawa took command of the Ashanti resistance, organizing fighters, overseeing ambushes, and laying siege to the British fort in Kumasi. Her warriors cut off supply routes, raided caravans, and held the city in a grip of defiance for months. And at the center of it all stood this grandmother, draped in battle cloth, musket in hand, unshaken. She was more than a figurehead, she was a tactician. She studied the enemy's weaknesses. She inspired her troops with ancient war chants. She reminded them, this fight was not only for land, it was for identity, for ancestors, and for the unborn children yet to know their name. The British called her rebellious. Her people called her mother of the resistance. Eventually the British broke through. They had superior firepower, reinforcements, and time. Yasantawa was captured. Her warriors were scattered. And yet, the one thing they came for, the golden stool, remained untouched. It was hidden, protected, never desecrated. Even in defeat, she had won a deeper war. Yasantawa was exiled to the Seychelles, far from the forests and people she loved. But exile did not erase her memory. Her defiance became legend, whispered in markets, sung in songs, painted on walls. Her name lit a fire in every young girl who knew her story. She was not just a queen. She was proof that resistance has no gender. They called her Moses, not because she parted seas, but because she parted chains. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, Harriet Tubman knew pain early. She endured beatings, hunger, and a near-fatal head injury that caused visions, flashes she later believed were messages from God. But pain didn't break her. It built her. And one day she ran north, alone, through woods, swamps, rivers, and danger, until she crossed into freedom. But her freedom wasn't enough. Most people would never look back. Harriet looked back, and then returned. And again, and again, and again. Over 13 missions, she led more than 70 enslaved people to freedom using a secret network known as the Underground Railroad. She carried a pistol, not to threaten slave catchers, but to give her passengers strength. You'll be free, she said, or die. She never lost a single person. She learned the routes, trusted the code words, studied the sky. She disguised herself, bribed guards, used nursery rhymes to send secret messages. She made allies of conductors, safe-house owners, and even abolitionists in government. Bounty hunters offered thousands for her capture. Posters called her wanted. Slaveholders feared her like a ghost in the trees. But she kept walking south. She kept returning, pulling families from darkness into dawn. When war broke out, she didn't retreat. She became a spy, scout, and nurse for the Union Army. She mapped rivers, led expeditions, and in 1863, she helped plan the Combahee River Raid, freeing over 700 enslaved people in a single night. She was the first woman in American history to lead a military raid. But she asked for no glory, just justice. After the war, she kept fighting for women's rights, education, and housing for the poor. She built homes for the elderly. She gave speeches for women's suffrage. She died in 1913, poor, often forgotten by the nation she helped save. But her story didn't fade. It rose. In churches. In classrooms. In songs. She didn't need a crown to be royalty. She didn't need a sword to be a warrior. She was Harriet Tubman, the woman who never lost a passenger. In the early 1600s, when the Portuguese came to seize land, people, and power in the heart of Central Africa, they met someone they did not expect, a woman who would not kneel. Her name was Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, and when she entered negotiations with the Portuguese, they offered no seat. Undeterred, Nzinga motioned for a servant to become her throne, sitting proudly on her back, eye to eye with the colonizers. That was her message. You will not place me below you. Nzinga wasn't just diplomatic, she was fierce. As the Portuguese pushed deeper into Angola, enslaving her people, Nzinga responded with war. She restructured her army, trained elite female warriors, and formed strategic alliances, even with former enemies. For decades, she resisted colonization with fire and steel. When her people were at risk of starvation, Nzinga took her kingdom into the mountains, waging a guerrilla campaign that would drain Portuguese resources for years. Her people called her Ngola, a title meaning ruler, which would later give the country its name, Angola. She used religion as strategy, converting to Christianity during diplomacy, but never surrendering her culture. In one moment, she prayed in Portuguese. In the next, she invoked ancestral spirits. Nzinga's power lay in her adaptability, weaponizing both sword and scripture. Even in old age, Nzinga rode into battle. Portuguese generals feared her so much they claimed she used magic to stay alive. But it was no spell. It was tactical brilliance and sheer will. Nzinga died at 80, undefeated. Though the Portuguese would later claim her land, they never broke her spirit. She proved that African women didn't just resist. They led nations in doing so. They called her a sorceress, a ghost in the trees, a woman no British bullet could touch. Her name was Nanny, and she led a war from the shadows. In the early 1700s, Jamaica's Blue Mountains weren't just a hideout. They were a kingdom. And Queen Nanny ruled from within, not with a crown, but with courage and cunning. Born in Ghana and brought to Jamaica in chains, Nanny escaped and vanished into the hills. There she helped build maroon societies, free black communities formed by escaped enslaved Africans. But Nanny didn't just survive. She organized, defended, and led. She trained warriors, set traps, taught the land like scripture. And in the heart of British Sugar Territory, she created a nation of rebels. The British had guns. Nanny had the forest. She turned every tree into a trap, every trail into a message. Her warriors struck in silence, then disappeared like smoke. She read British movements, used decoys, dug ambush pits, and always they returned with more freed souls. To the British, she wasn't just a leader. She was a phantom. Nanny wasn't fighting for revenge. She was fighting for sovereignty. Under her rule, the Maroons developed codes, farms, and spiritual practices that mixed African traditions with new rituals. They were self-sufficient, free, and armed. For nearly 30 years, she led raids, rescues, and standoffs, refusing to bow to British demands. Even when her village, Nanny Town, was attacked, her spirit never broke. By the mid-1700s, the British had had enough. They signed a treaty, one of the few in history, where colonial powers recognized African autonomy in the New World. Nanny, whose real face was never captured, became legend. Some said she could catch bullets. Others swore she vanished and reappeared at will. But one truth remains. She was a black woman who led, fought, and won. Today, she's a Jamaican national hero. Her face is on the $500 bill. But her real legacy lives in every voice that says, "We will not be broken." Before the gunpowder empires carved borders into Africa, the Hausa city-states thrived across the Sahel. Among them stood Zaza, a powerful kingdom known for trade, culture, and military might. In the 1500s, a young princess named Amina was born into its royal household. But Amina was not raised in silk and silence. From an early age, she trained with warriors, studied tactics, and rode alongside soldiers. Her grandfather recognized something fierce in her, and by the time she came of age, Amina wasn't just a royal. She was a commander. When her brother, the king, died, Amina claimed the throne. Not to rule from behind palace walls, but to lead on the battlefield. Amina didn't inherit peace. She forged power through war. Mounting a steed and donning chainmail, she personally led her cavalry into campaigns that expanded Zaza's borders further than any ruler before her. Her armies were feared across West Africa. Her presence on the battlefield was commanding, a queen with blade in hand, shield in place, and an empire behind her. It's said she never married, refusing to be ruled by any man. Her heart belonged to her people, and her purpose was conquest. Amina made clear, Zaza was not to be trifled with. But Amina wasn't just a warrior, she was an architect of empire. She ordered the construction of defensive walls around each city she conquered, creating a legacy of protection and strategy. Some of these fortifications, known today as Ganyor Amina or Amina's Walls, still stand across northern Nigeria. She secured trade routes, enforced toll systems, and made Zaza a hub of economic and political power. Merchants traveled safely under her reign, and her kingdom's wealth soared. Amina's rule brought not just military expansion, but order, infrastructure, and prosperity. In a world where queens were expected to remain in shadows, Amina ruled under the sun. She broke every expectation, not out of defiance, but because she saw no limits to what she could do. She chose war when others chose compromise. She ruled directly when others used male intermediaries. Stories claim that every city she conquered was marked by her presence, and that she took no husband, only temporary companions. Whether myth or truth, one thing remains clear. Amina lived by her own code. Her rule was not just political. It was cultural. She redefined what leadership could look like in a woman's hands. Amina's death is cloaked in mystery. Some say she fell in battle. Others claim she died peacefully after decades of rule. But her impact was undeniable. She left behind an empire whose borders stretched farther than Zaza had ever seen. Her walls protected cities long after she was gone. And her name became legend, passed down in songs, stories, and stone. In a time when empires were carved by men, Queen Amina proved that a woman could wield the sword and the future. They called her the One-Eyed Queen. Amina-Irenas ruled the ancient kingdom of Kush in what is now Sudan, and she did not flinch when Rome came knocking. After the death of her husband, she led one of the fiercest military campaigns ever seen against the most powerful empire in the world. After her husband, King Teretikas, died in battle, Amina-Irenas didn't mourn quietly. She picked up his sword, literally, and vowed to strike back. With her young son at her side, she took command of the Kushite army. Her eye was lost in an earlier battle, but her vision for her people had never been clearer. Rome had just annexed Egypt under Emperor Augustus and assumed Nubia would fall just as easily. They were wrong. Amina-Irenas led a surprise attack into Roman-held Egypt, capturing cities and even decapitating statues of Caesar. One of those heads she buried beneath a temple threshold so her people would walk over Rome's emperor every day. Rome retaliated hard. General Petronius pushed south with legions, torching towns and seizing Kushite territories. But Amina-Irenas refused to surrender. She retreated into the deep south, regrouping, rallying allies, and preparing for a long campaign. After years of fighting and mounting losses, Rome realized something. Kush wasn't going to break. Amina-Irenas opened peace talks, but not from weakness. She demanded Roman withdrawal from key territories and got it. The resulting treaty granted her kingdom autonomy, ending hostilities and securing Kushite independence for decades. Amina-Irenas wasn't just a warrior, she was a strategist, a diplomat, and a national symbol. She ruled with fire and grace, defying an empire that thought itself unstoppable. In a world where Rome conquered nearly everything it touched, Amina-Irenas made sure Kush was not one of them. The drums of open rebellion may have faded, but a deeper war was still being waged, one not fought with blades or bullets, but with parchment, pulpits, and prophecy. It was a war of belief. Because slavery doesn't survive on force alone. It requires something more sinister, a story, a reason, a justification, one that sounds righteous, even divine. And so across centuries and continents, religion was recruited into the service of oppression. Christianity, Islam, systems meant to uplift the spirit, used instead to shackle the body. This is not a story of faith. This is a story of how faith was twisted into a tool, how sacred words were bent to defend the indefensible. Not by prophets, but by power. As European empires expanded, many slave traders, monarchs, and priests turned to the Bible to justify their growing empire of bondage. They quoted passages like, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling," Ephesians 6 verse 5. "Cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." Genesis 9 verse 25. From pulpits in London to plantations in Virginia, preachers taught that black Africans were descendants of Ham, cursed to eternal servitude. It wasn't theology. It was strategy. This so-called curse of Ham became one of the most lethal lies in history, a racial myth not found in any legitimate doctrine, but repackaged to baptize slavery in holy water. Paradoxically, many enslaved Africans were baptized into Christianity. But baptism didn't set them free. It chained them deeper. In the early colonial period, there was debate. Could a Christian enslave another Christian? The answer eventually was yes, if they were black. Laws were rewritten across colonies. In Barbados, 1661, the slave codes permitted Christian masters to enslave Christian converts without guilt. In Virginia, laws declared that baptism did not change the status of the enslaved. Churches were built on slave plantations. Priests held Bibles in one hand and led sermons inside churches funded by slave labor. Christianity wasn't just present in slavery, it was baked into its machinery. Europe didn't just want labor, it wanted legacy. And so began the civilizing mission, the belief that Africans were spiritually lost and morally inferior. That slavery was, in fact, a gift, a path to salvation. Missionaries preached that by enslaving Africans, Europeans were saving their souls. They built schools, but taught only submission. They preached Christ, but silenced African identity. They erased indigenous religions, calling them pagan, demonic, or barbaric. In many cases, conversion was forced. Africans were renamed with Christian names. They were forbidden to speak native tongues. Drums, central to African spiritual practice, were banned on plantations. The message was clear: serve your master. Then you may serve God. But Christianity wasn't the only religion entangled in slavery. Centuries before the Atlantic trade began, the Islamic world had already established vast slave networks across North and East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of Asia. From the 7th century onward, the Arab slave trade captured millions. Many were taken from present-day Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and the Swahili coast. Enslaved people were used as domestic servants, concubines, soldiers, and laborers across the Islamic caliphates. Islamic law did set some limits. Slaves were to be treated humanely. Masters were encouraged to free slaves as an act of piety. Conversion to Islam could sometimes offer paths to freedom. But in practice, the system grew massive and brutal. Enslaved Africans were often castrated to serve in royal courts, especially in the Abbasid Caliphate. Many were forced to convert or were born into generations of bondage. In the 9th century, in what is now Iraq, a massive uprising of East African slaves, known as the Zanj Rebellion, shook the foundations of the Abbasid Empire. For 15 years, these enslaved workers fought for freedom, capturing cities and building fortresses. It was one of the largest and longest slave revolts in human history, but is often left out of textbooks, because it tells a dangerous truth. Enslaved people always fought back. As Islam spread across West Africa, it brought both literacy and law, but also inherited a system of servitude. Many Muslim leaders in Mali, Songhai, and Hausa kingdoms owned slaves. Islamic scholars like Ibn Khaldun wrote that black Africans were more suitable for servitude, a claim that mirrored racist ideas in Europe. And while Islam generally prohibited enslaving fellow Muslims, this was often ignored. Slave markets thrived in Timbuktu, Kano, Zanzibar, Cairo. By the 18th century, some African Muslim leaders actively collaborated with both Arab and European slave traders. Once again, religion was bent to serve profit. But faith was not just used for oppression. It was also used for rebellion. Christianity and Islam both inspired resistance movements. Enslaved Africans often blended their traditional spiritual beliefs with new religious teachings, creating syncretic systems. In Haiti, Vodou merged African religion with Catholicism and helped launch the Haitian Revolution. In Brazil, candomblé preserved Yoruba deities under Catholic disguises. In the American South, spirituals like "Go Down Moses" weren't just songs, they were coded calls for escape. Likewise, Muslim slaves, especially in places like Senegal and Bahia, launched revolts guided by Quranic principles of justice and freedom. Faith didn't always enslave. Sometimes it led to revolt. By the 1800s, European missionaries played a double role. Some genuinely fought against slavery, building schools, hospitals, and advocating for human rights. But many others laid the ideological groundwork for colonization, teaching Africans that their history began with European contact, promoting the idea that European culture and religion were superior, destroying traditional shrines, banning indigenous practices, and calling African priests witch doctors. In places like Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, Christian missions helped pave the road for European imperialism. And in many areas, missionary schools replaced slave ships, but continued the work of mental domination. The religious justification for slavery left deep scars. It taught colonizers that God was on their side. It taught the enslaved to question their own worth. It fractured families, destroyed cultures, and sanctified suffering. Even after abolition, the effects lingered. In education systems that erased African history. In churches that remained silent about their role. In mosques that denied the scale of the Eastern trade. The question isn't whether Christianity or Islam caused slavery. The truth is darker. Slavery used both. And millions paid the price for theologies twisted into chains. Today, Christianity and Islam are major religions in Africa, not just because of conquest, but because people claimed them back. Africans reinterpreted scripture. They built their own churches, mosques, and movements. They used faith not to enslave, but to heal, rebuild, and resist. But the story of religion and slavery can't be ignored. Because if the Bible and the Quran were used to bless slave ships, they must also be used to uncover the truth. And the truth is this. Chains were wrapped in scripture, but so were the keys that broke them. Queen Amanirenas stood her ground against Rome. Faith had been twisted into shackles in segment 5. Now we follow the trail of silver. Because slavery wasn't sustained by hatred alone. It was sustained by economics. Not just stolen labor, but an entire global system engineered around one brutal truth. Flesh was currency. Slavery was not a relic of barbarism, it was the engine of modern capitalism. From the 1500s to the 1800s, European empires didn't just colonize land, they colonized labor. They didn't just need workers. They needed unpaid, disposable bodies. Slavery became a business model. Ships were financed by banks. Plantations were insured. Captives were listed on ledgers, auctioned on exchanges, and counted in balance sheets. This wasn't random. It was designed. Sugar changed everything. Before the Atlantic trade, sugar was a luxury, expensive, rare, and exotic. But by the 1700s, it was the daily fuel of European households. In tea, in desserts, in medicine, and behind every teaspoon was a back broken under Caribbean sun. Jamaica, Saint Domingue, Barbados. These islands became sugar factories where enslaved Africans labored 18-hour days in brutal conditions. The cane stalks cut their flesh. The boiling houses blistered their skin. Mortality rates were so high, enslaved populations had to be constantly replenished by new ships. They were never meant to live long. They were meant to produce. In the American South, cotton was king, and slavery was its crown. By the early 1800s, the U.S. was the world's largest cotton exporter. Over 50% of enslaved Americans worked in cotton. Field hands picked, cleaned, sorted, and bagged the fiber that clothed Europe's elite. Tobacco, meanwhile, enriched Virginia and Maryland, funding universities, towns, and the very constitution of a new republic. These weren't side products of slavery. These were its profits. George Washington enslaved people. So did Thomas Jefferson. And both built wealth from the crops enslaved people harvested. Freedom, it turned out, was financed by bondage. The transatlantic trade followed a ruthless triangle. Europe's Africa. Ships carried guns, liquor, and textiles. Africa-America's enslaved people. America's Europe. Sugar, cotton, tobacco, rum, gold. Each corner profited. Liverpool, Nantes, Lisbon, Amsterdam. Their ports exploded with wealth. Mansions were built. Banks founded. Universities funded. Museums today still carry the names of men who traded in flesh. Even the insurance industry grew from slave cargo. Lloyd's of London insured slave ships like modern fleets. This wasn't just a trade. It was the global economy. People weren't just captured. They were valued. In Europe and the Americas, enslaved people were collateral for loans, assets on balance sheets, objects to be leased, mortgaged, inherited. In the U.S., banks issued mortgage bonds backed by slave labor. You didn't have to own a plantation to profit. You could invest from afar. And when enslaved people were killed, insurance companies reimbursed the loss of property. Not a soul, a number. Look around. New York's Wall Street was once a slave market. Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston all benefited. Rio de Janeiro became the largest slave port in the world. London's skyline grew from Caribbean sugar. In France, fortunes were made from Saint-Domingue, the richest colony on earth, until the enslaved rose in the Haitian Revolution. And in the Netherlands, Dutch East and West India companies ran vast slave operations, while Amsterdam banks quietly moved the profits. The cities that shine today are paved with pain. Modern myths claim slavery was inefficient, outdated, primitive. Nothing could be further from the truth. Enslavers tracked productivity per person. They calculated average lifespans for optimal replacement. They used data, human accounting, to maximize labor. Enslaved Africans weren't just worked. They were managed like machines. This wasn't pre-modern. This was industrial, before the factories ever came. And it taught Europe how to scale profit on suffering. Even after abolition, the wealth remained. Families that once traded slaves still own corporations. Universities like Harvard, Yale, Oxford are now reckoning with endowments rooted in slavery. Museums exhibit artifacts from colonized lands looted during the same era. And most reparations? Still unpaid. Slavery ended on paper, but its economic shadow still cloaks the world. While Europe rose, Africa bled. Entire workforces vanished. Local industries collapsed. Wars were stoked by foreign traders to keep the supply flowing. Rather than producing for itself, Africa became a supplier of bodies. Some regions depopulated. Some kingdoms collapsed. Innovation was stifled for centuries. The human cost wasn't just who was taken. It was what never got built. In every ledger there was a price. In every voyage a margin. In every plantation a yield. But behind every number was a name. And behind every name was a story never told. The world's richest nations didn't rise in spite of slavery. They rose because of it. Flesh built fortunes. Profit built empires. And capitalism learned its first cruel lesson. If it breathes, it can be sold. As the slave ships reached the New World, the chains did not loosen. They tightened into law, land, and labor. From Brazil's sugar fields to the plantations of the American South, slavery became not just a system, but a civilization built on bondage. Yet amid the pain and cruelty, resistance never stopped. In every field, on every coast, and in every whisper passed between the enslaved, survival was an act of defiance. Brazil received more enslaved Africans than any other country, over 4 million. Nearly half of all transatlantic captives ended up in Portuguese-controlled Brazil. They came to work sugar plantations, known as engenhos, engines of profit that chewed through human lives. The work was relentless. Chopping sugarcane under a blazing sun. Feeding crushing machines with bare hands. Sleeping on dirt floors, waking to the whip. Slavery here was especially brutal. No legal protections, no limits to punishment, and often no chance at survival. The average enslaved person in Brazil survived just 7 years after arrival. But Brazil was also home to quilombos, runaway slave communities deep in the jungle. The most famous, Quilombo dos Palmares, a self-governed city of escapees that stood for nearly a century. Led by the warrior Zumbi, Palmares defended itself from colonial troops and offered freedom to all who reached it. Even in the heart of cruelty, freedom found a way to fight back. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, sugar made France rich, but at a monstrous cost. By the late 1700s, enslaved Africans made up 90% of the population. They produced 60% of Europe's coffee and 40% of its sugar. French aristocrats lived in decadence, while enslaved people were tortured, branded, and worked to death. But in 1791, the ground cracked. Led by Toussaint Louverture, de Tubman, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, enslaved Haitians rose up in one of the most coordinated slave revolts in human history. It wasn't just rebellion. It was revolution. Plantations burned. Owners fled. French soldiers were driven back, not once but again and again. In 1804, Haiti became the first black republic and the first country born from a successful slave revolt. It terrified the world's empires, because Haiti proved something they all feared. Freedom was not only possible, it was inevitable. In the United States, slavery took on a uniquely cruel legal and cultural form. It was coded into law, protected by guns, and justified by religion and race science. By the 1800s, the Southern economy depended entirely on cotton, dubbed King Cotton, and cotton depended on enslaved labor. From sunup to sundown, enslaved people planted, picked, and cleaned cotton. Children were separated from their mothers on auction blocks. Families were sold like cattle. Brutality was not the exception. It was the rule. But resistance ran through every row of cotton. Some escaped north, following the stars and secret networks, like the Underground Railroad, where Harriet Tubman led dozens to freedom. Others resisted by breaking tools, poisoning food, holding secret ceremonies to preserve their identity and faith. One name stands out: Nat Turner. In 1831, Turner led a rebellion in Virginia, killing slaveholders and striking fear into the heart of the South. Though it was crushed, it forced America to confront the rage that centuries of bondage had built. In all three regions, Brazil, Haiti, the U.S., survival wasn't passive. To sing in their native tongues, to pass stories to children, to dance, cook, pray, and love in a world designed to erase them. All of it was rebellion. Women braided escape maps into hair. Men taught secret languages through drums. Entire communities forged hidden religions, like candomblé in Brazil, voodoo in Haiti, and the spirituals in the American South. These acts defied the slave master's whip and denied the colonizer's plan. They said simply and powerfully, "We are still here." What connected Brazil's sugar fields, Haiti's revolution, and America's cotton empire was more than slavery. It was a shared cry, echoing across oceans. A cry for dignity. A cry for home. A cry that said, "We are not your property. We are people." And though the chains were forged in Europe, though the plantations were mapped by merchants, though the whips cracked across 3 continents, it was the enslaved who shaped the soul of the Americas. From samba to soul, from spirituals to jazz, from voodoo to resistance theology, from Zumbi to Harriet, they changed the world that tried to break them. Slavery was abolished, but it never truly ended. It just changed its face, from plantations to policies. What the ships carried across the Atlantic wasn't just bodies. It was a legacy. A legacy of stolen wealth, disrupted nations, broken systems, and scars that bleed into the present. This is not just the past. It's the architecture of now. In the United States, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, with one exception. Except as a punishment for crime. That exception became a loophole big enough to build an industry. After emancipation, Southern states passed black codes and vagrancy laws, criminalizing freedom itself. Thousands of newly freed black men were arrested for loitering, fined, and leased to plantations, mines, and factories. It was called convict leasing, and it was slavery by another name. Fast forward to today. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of whites. Private prisons profit from bodies behind bars, just as planters once did from fields. The system hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. What was taken from Africa and her descendants wasn't just labor. It was wealth, generational opportunity, time, invention, capital. European nations enriched themselves on sugar, cotton, tobacco, and gold, none of which would have been possible without enslaved labor. That profit didn't vanish. It was invested. In banks still active today, in cities like Bristol, Liverpool, Lisbon, and Bordeaux, in universities, estates, railways, and royal treasuries. Meanwhile, Africa was plundered and African-descended peoples were locked out of wealth building for generations. Reparations were never paid to the enslaved, but in some cases, slave owners were compensated for their loss. Even in the Caribbean, formerly enslaved colonies were forced to pay back their colonizers, plunging them into centuries of debt. Wealth was extracted, but was never returned. Today, racism isn't just a slur or a headline. It's a machine, quiet, legal, and devastating. In education, underfunded schools, biased curricula, and high suspension rates for black children. In housing, redlining, denied mortgages, and neighborhoods starved of investment. In healthcare, Higher maternal mortality, shorter life expectancy, limited access. In the workplace, wage gaps, glass ceilings, and fewer promotions. These aren't glitches. They're features, programmed over centuries. And in every region touched by slavery, from the U.S. to Brazil to South Africa, its fingerprints remain. Racism was institutionalized to justify slavery. Now it survives to protect what slavery built. For the descendants of the enslaved, the trauma didn't stop with chains. It became intergenerational. Names were stripped. Languages erased. Ancestors hidden. To this day, millions can trace their DNA to West Africa, but not their family tree. That history was burned, sold, or never written down. Colonial narratives painted blackness as inferior, dangerous, animalistic. These lies were taught for centuries, in churches, classrooms, courts, and labs. And they left scars. Internalized shame. Loss of cultural identity. Constant pressure to prove humanity. This, too, was part of slavery's legacy, not just physical chains, but psychological ones. Africa didn't just lose people. It lost centuries of potential. The transatlantic slave trade depopulated regions, fueled internal wars, and collapsed kingdoms. Then came colonization, slicing up the continent with artificial borders, draining resources, and delaying independence by centuries. Today, many African nations still face the economic, political, and environmental aftermath. Corruption and conflict often trace back to colonial strategies of division and extraction. The West still benefits from trade imbalances, debt traps, and neo-colonial contracts. It wasn't just a slave trade. It was a continent-breaking machine. Walk through the museums of Europe, the Louvre, the British Museum, the Vatican, and you'll find Benin bronzes stolen during raids, Egyptian mummies looted during excavations, African artifacts labeled as curiosities, stripped of context. What isn't there is the truth. Entire cultures were plundered, reinterpreted, and displayed through a colonial lens. Even in media, African heroes are erased. Black stories are minimized. Slavery is softened or skipped. History wasn't just rewritten. It was whitewashed. From Black Lives Matter protests to demands for reparations, the struggle continues. Across the globe, countries like Barbados and Ghana are pushing for historical accountability. Descending communities are suing institutions that profited from slavery. Artists, educators, and historians are reclaiming the story, correcting the lie. Because the wound isn't fully healed. But now the silence is breaking. And in its place, a chorus rises. We remember. We resist. We reclaim. History doesn't just happen. It's told. And for centuries, the story of Africa and its diaspora was told by those who stole from it. But that's changing. From Harlem to Lagos, from Bahia to Accra, from Port-au-Prince to Paris. The descendants of the stolen are rewriting the script. Not as victims. As survivors. As architects of memory and makers of meaning. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, griots and scholars are unearthing oral histories, rebuilding lineages lost to the Atlantic. In Brazil and the Caribbean, communities are reviving languages, dances, and rituals once outlawed under slavery. In the U.S., DNA testing is connecting African Americans to tribes, regions, and names, restoring ancestral connection once thought gone forever. The goal isn't just to mourn the past. It's to reclaim it. Because history doesn't belong to the conquerors alone. It belongs to the descendants of the defiant. Across the world, Black artists are retelling the story, on canvas, in music, through film and fashion. Painters recreate the Middle Passage in surrealist palettes. Rappers trace bloodlines back to Yoruba gods. Filmmakers put African queens on screen, not as myths, but as monarchs. Art becomes a weapon, a map, a way home. Even traditional African spiritualities once demonized, Ifa, Vodun, Candomblé, are being reclaimed. Not as superstition, but as living systems of wisdom. What was once demonized is now being celebrated on album covers, runways, and world stages. This is more than aesthetic. It's spiritual insurgency. For generations, history books began with slavery as if Africa had no story before chains. Now new curriculums are emerging. In South Africa, post-apartheid syllabi highlight pre-colonial empires. In Jamaica and Barbados, students learn about the Maroons, Queen Nanny, and Toussaint Louverture. In Europe and the U.S., pressure mounts to decolonize the classroom and tell the truth. Educators, parents, and students are demanding more than footnotes. They want the full story. The builders of Great Zimbabwe. The the warriors of Angola, the mathematicians of Timbuktu. Because identity is shaped by memory, and without memory, there's no future. In Ghana, the year of return drew thousands of African Americans seeking ancestral reconnection. Many wept on the shores where their ancestors were taken. Others bought land, started businesses, and began a second chapter, not as tourists but as returnees. The African diaspora is no longer scattered and silent. It's reconnecting, rebuilding, reclaiming. Social media bridges the Atlantic. Conferences, festivals, family reunions, they're stitching together a torn fabric. And what was once a wound becomes a scar of strength. From TikTok historians to YouTube documentaries, the internet is changing the game. No longer does history depend on publishers or approval boards. Young creators are unearthing colonial crimes. Descendants are sharing family stories once buried in shame. Survivors of colorism, caste, and racism are building digital libraries of truth. Algorithms once spread ignorance. Now they're being hijacked for justice. Hashtags become archives. Threads become revolutions. Clicks become curriculum. This is history, decolonized and democratized. Across the Americas, descendants are remembering publicly. Libations poured for unnamed ancestors. Pilgrimages to slave dungeons and sugar plantations. National days of remembrance, from Juneteenth to Emancipation Day in Trinidad. Memorials are being built. Statues of the enslaved, not the enslavers. Museums focused on Black resistance. Reparation funds launched by churches, governments, and universities. Because healing requires truth, and truth must be seen. Today, Black women lead global movements. Indigenous Africans head tech startups. Afro-Caribbean economists design future-facing green economies. The story is shifting, from survival to sovereignty, from silence to spotlight, from exploited labor to authors of destiny. The chains may not be literal anymore, but the work of breaking them, all of them, continues. Not in despair, but with fire. The chains may be broken, the ships may be gone, but the silence remains. For centuries, the world has profited quietly from the unpaid labor, stolen lives, and destroyed futures of millions of Africans and their descendants. So the question now isn't just what happened, it's what now? No empire rose alone. No wealth came from thin air. The sugarcane that sweetened Europe's tea. The cotton that fed its factories. The gold, ivory, and palm oil that lined its banks. They were watered with blood. The profits from slavery didn't vanish. They became railroads, banks, universities, museums, endowments. Families in Britain, France, Portugal, and the U.S. passed on generational wealth, not just through land or stock, but through the bones of the enslaved. And in the shadows of that wealth, the descendants of those enslaved still fight for equity. Still inherit the poverty their ancestors were forced into. Reparations aren't charity. They are not pity. They are a bill long overdue. They are the recognition that nations grew rich by engineering Black poverty and that this damage wasn't accidental. Jamaica has calculated the value of what was stolen. Barbados is demanding restitution. In the U.S., H.R. 40 seeks to explore federal reparations for African Americans. But opposition is fierce. Some say it's too late. Others, we weren't there. But the effects are here. And the profits still sit in European treasuries, Ivy League vaults, and Wall Street portfolios. Reparations could mean debt forgiveness, land return, direct financial compensation, institutional investment in Black communities, official apology, and education reform. To ignore it is to say what was done was fine as long as we benefit. Why do African nations remain among the poorest while their former colonizers remain the richest? Is no accident. During the height of empire, Europe extracted raw materials, human labor, cultural treasures, and gave back little but chains and scars. The post-colonial world was born into imbalance. Independence didn't come with compensation. The West kept the gold and handed back broken systems. Today, African nations pay billions in interest on colonial-era loans. Their stolen artifacts fill Western museums. Their youth migrate, not from failure, but from systems designed to fail them. Justice isn't just courts and trials. It's restoration. It's acknowledgement. It's change. Some fear reparations will divide. But what divides is denial. Germany paid reparations to Holocaust survivors. Japanese-American families received formal apologies and compensation. Why is justice for the descendants of African slavery still controversial? Because power fears truth. and profit resists accountability. But healing requires both. Some faith leaders call for reconciliation. They ask for peace. And yes, faith played a role in both justifying slavery and in resisting it. But forgiveness without justice is just forgetting. And forgetting ensures repetition. Around the world, churches are now examining their own pasts, issuing statements, offering land, funding education. But is it enough? From Lagos to London, Harlem to Havana, Accra to Atlanta, the African diaspora is not broken, it is awakened. Black artists, scholars, leaders, and activists are forging new movements, reclaiming old names and rewriting stolen stories. Afrofuturism, Pan-Africanism, repatriation, reparations, global black solidarity. From George Floyd to #EndSARS, the pain is connected. So is the power. The world often asks, why are you still talking about slavery? But the real question is, why haven't we done anything about it? Slavery wasn't a moment. It was a machine. And it didn't disappear. It evolved into systems of incarceration, economic exclusion, and cultural theft. So no, time alone does not heal. Only truth, justice, and repair can. The story of slavery is not over. Not as long as its echoes remain in prisons, in policies, in poverty. Not as long as black children must prove their humanity. Not as long as stolen wealth goes unreturned. Not as long as the world benefits from a crime it refuses to name fully. We can rewrite the ending, but not by skipping chapters. Not by painting over pain. The world cannot move forward until it looks back. Until it names the theft, returns what was stolen, and builds something better, not just for the descendants of the enslaved, but for all who believe in dignity. This isn't about guilt. It's about responsibility. Because the beast of slavery may be gone, but its footprints lead directly to today. This isn't just history. It's inheritance. The chains may be gone, but the echoes remain. In our cities, our systems, our silence. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Teach it. Question what you've been taught. Because remembering is resistance. And truth is power. Subscribe to Forgotten Realms and uncover the stories they tried to erase.